Tora.
Okay. Thank you, Ronit. Now, before we hear Dr. Francis Naumann's talk, I just want to mention what Francis will probably tell you himself, that we have a long connection with the museum and Dr. Naumann, because in 1982, he came to Enhod and he interviewed Marcel Janco. It was his last and most important interview. And it was for the Arts Manuscript magazine, and we still, or at least I always quote from it in my research. And today, Dr. Francis Naumann came all the way from New York, and he's a researcher of history of arts, but he also used to be a journalist and a gallerist, and etc., etc. And he is going to conclude this series of international lectures by talking about Marcel Janco, the Dada years. So Yuval, if you can put the presentation, we can start. Francis, it's all yours.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right, good. Okay, I want to welcome everyone and begin with an apology, because a keynote lecture, of course, should begin a series of lectures and not end it. I had a medical problem that turned out to be a colossal misdiagnosis. And I'm okay, just for the record, and very happy to be here today. And I once gave a lecture that was subtitled "Better Late Than Never," and at least I'm here now and available for this. You can advance the next slide, Yuval. Just this is the title slide, and I may as well get right into it. Can Yuval not hear me? There. Good. Okay. As Raya mentioned, I was a dealer actually for nearly 20 years. I closed the gallery last year. But you can become a gallerist, but you cannot remove the scholar from the gallerist. And I never could throughout my entire career working as a dealer. I published a lot of catalogs, to the detriment of my financial position, but I couldn't help myself. And maybe just as appropriately, I have to begin this talk with some bibliographic background. Before I went to Israel to interview Marcel Janco, I had those 3 books that you see up on the screen. One that was published in 1983, the monograph by Mendelssohn, with whom I corresponded about Janco. And in 1963, a book came out, same year, by Michel Sifour, the French historian, and I had that in hand. I also actually owned the book on the right by Willy Verkauft, but never knew that it had an entire chapter in it on Dada written by Marcel Janco. I didn't know about it before I went to Israel to interview him, and I'm actually quite happy that I didn't, because I might have asked him a whole different series of questions based on that chapter. And that chapter was really written for other Dadaists, not so much as a historical record, which of course was what I was going for. But in the Michel Sifour book, the one in the middle, there is one sentence that stood out among all others that possessed me. He wrote that of all the artists whose fame is not proportional to the value of their work, there's one, to my knowledge, for whom the disproportion is so flagrant. Janco's works of the Dada period remain one of the most solid plastic expressions of the whole movement. It is incomprehensible that they should even today be so little known. And that was a book published in 1963, and I was fully in accord with those sentiments about Janco's work when I first read that book, probably at some point in the mid-1970s. So again, advance the next two slides, and here's the rest of my bibliographic presentation. Yuval, could you advance the next two? Good. Okay. That book on the left is a book that I could not have had in hand. Of course, when I went to interview Janco, came out a year later. It was the 1984 monograph on his work, which he sent to me. I'll mention that again more toward the end of this. But there is a book I do not to this day even yet have. It's a biography of Janco written in German and published in 1993. But much of what was said in that biography is distilled and presented in that book you see on the right, published in 2006. That is a actually rather important book. And if I had that before I interviewed Janco, there could very well be a lot of questions I would not have had to ask him. It's by a man named Tom Sandquist, whom I do not know, but a Swedish scholar. It's called Dada East, and it's subtitled The Romanians of the Cabaret Voltaire. It was published by MIT Press in 2006. And as Duchamp once said of another book, it drinks heavily from the biography in the center there. But it does go through quite a bit of Janco's past in Romania with Tristan Tzara and the publication of their early magazine, Simbol. Now, if you advance the next two slides, I, as a matter of background, have to explain how I came to conduct this interview with Janco and where my interests were when I entered the graduate program at the City University of New York to begin studies for a PhD in the early 1970s. I decided at a certain point that I would write about Dada, but I didn't know exactly what aspect of Dada and felt it was my responsibility to go at least and see the places where Dada took place. So on one of my trips to Europe in the mid-70s, I visited the location of the original Cabaret Voltaire, which you see in the photograph on the left. It was at #1 Spiegelgasse. At the time, you could enter in the same door that you see the woman in the other screen passing by, and you would be ushered upstairs to the larger room above, which was still at that time a bar. But they knew very little at the time about what took place in that space. But they were, of course, just bartenders. They couldn't help me very much. But on the outside of the building, there was a plaque designed by Jean Arp. You can see that circular form in the middle of the slide at the bottom, where it says, in this place, on February 5th, 1916, the Cabaret Voltaire started the Dada movement. At least that was there. But to the right, you'll see another sign attached to a building right up that street. You can see that street in the slide on the left ascending. If you go up to that street and go to where it summits, on the right-hand side is where Lenin himself lived. And you'll notice on the plaque, it said, here lived Lenin from, as you see, the 21st of February, 1916. Now that's only a few weeks after the 5th of February, 1916, when the Dada movement began. So of course, naturally, I asked myself the question, wow, did Lenin ever walk down the street and go meet these Dadas? When I came back home, I started to really thoroughly go through the literature, and I was quite shocked that no one mentioned it. No one ever asked one of the Dadas if Lenin stopped by. So I was determined from that point forward that I would find out the answer to that question, which is what led me really to Marcel Janco when I discovered he was still living. Now, the cabaret itself, if you look at that, that's a modern picture where it says Cabaret Voltaire at the top. When I was there, it had more or less fallen in disrepair, and when the bar that owned it vacated it, it was taken over by students at the beginning of the 20th century, I think in 2005. Eventually, the police forced them out, but eventually a person purchased the cabaret and has acknowledged the existence of Dada. And the spirit of Dada still very much exists there, because now the second floor is transformed into a gallery space where they show the work of artists who are influenced by Dada. And just this morning, I subscribed to their website. They announced a new show that would open next year by an artist who has a direct connection with Dada, a direct influence, and he openly acknowledged that to Dada. So in a way, what's happening there at the Cabaret Voltaire is similar to what's happening in on Houd, the village where Raya is the director, where the Janco-Dada Museum exists. But anyway, now advance the next two slides. Now give you an idea of how this lecture came about. Raya, I don't know if I have to say your name each time. Could you advance the next slide? There, good. What you see up here are the various Dada personalities who in the mid-1970s I was intent on meeting, but didn't succeed because of the fact that they either died just after I attempted to contact them, or they were long already gone. Marcel Duchamp, the first one up on the left, I was actually in the same room with him for about 15 minutes without knowing that he was seated in an audience just in front of me. I will kick myself to the end of my life for not having gone up to speak with him, because I knew very well already by then who he was. I was a student in Buffalo in 1968, and he came to be part of a Mears Cunningham performance there, but I never knew he was in the room in front of me. And I left early, and at the end, he got up on the stage. So to this day, I watch everything that is presented to me to its bitter end, hoping because something might good still come out of it. Believe me, I've watched some horrible movies and punished myself forever for having left that performance early. Man Ray, the next person on that list, he died in 1976, but in 1976, I wrote him a letter, which his widow told me he read, but he was too infirm to be able to answer me. So I was never able to meet him. Of course, the others I could not have met. Picabia died in 53, Hugo Ball in 27. Emmy Hennings died in the year I was born in 1948. I was just a few months old when she died. And Tristan Tzara, I was only 15 years old when he died in 1963. But the other personalities you see on the right were still living. Beatrice Wood, who's there in a photograph with Picabia and Marcel Duchamp, it was born, well, I can't actually see those dates, but anyway, she was born in 1893. So she was in her 80s when I went out to meet her in 1976. And Marcel Janco was 85 years old at the time. So I immediately, well, I went out to meet Beatrice Wood. I interviewed her, but that's a totally different story. And I was intent on meeting Janco, but didn't know how I could ever do it. I was a student with not any means to get myself to Israel. But if you advance the next slide, Yuval, there we have it. I did eventually find a means. In 1981, so that's coming up on 40 years ago, I wrote to a woman named Etty Weiseltier. She was a friend of mine, and I had a photograph of her that's there in the lower left corner. I knew her, I think, through the Israeli artist Michael Scan-Cohen, who was a very good friend of mine. He was at the time not an artist. He was studying art history like I was at the Graduate Center of the City University. And through him, I met her, and then I wrote to her thinking, okay, I'm not going to be able to interview Janco myself. First of all, I didn't know whether or not he even spoke English. And in that letter I wrote to her in 1981, I asked her to relay a series of questions that I had for him. And I even warned her that they were very precise, but I even said that he might suffer at a stage of acute senility at this point, so it wouldn't matter what type of question I asked anyway. Interestingly enough, he responded in a one-page letter to my questions, but they were rather cursory in format. And as luck would have it, a man called me up at my home named Itche Mambush, and you see him in the upper right-hand corner. He was a very close friend of Marcel Janco, and that photograph below shows Janco working in a print studio with Itche Mambush, who is there on the left. Well, he asked me if I would actually go to Israel and interview Janco. I said, of course I would. He volunteered to pay for my flight. And in writing to Eti Weiseltier, she said she could put me up in the apartment she shared with her daughter, and I did. I went to Israel, and I just put these slides just come up because they involve a collaborative project between Iche Mambush and Janco. That I just wanted to give some background as how they knew one another. But I learned that an entire article was written on this subject, but it's in Hebrew, so I wouldn't be able to read it. But Raya Zolmertal wrote that article, and I'm sure would make it available to anyone who took an interest. This happens to be a glazed ceramic tile work that's at the University of Haifa that was, at least according to what I could find on the internet, produced collaboratively with Marcel Janco and Mambush. I don't know who did what in particular, but at least it's evidence of their close friendship. Well, if you advance to the next slide, I did arrive in Israel on a flight that I will not tell you about. It was a bit of a disaster, but okay, I got there. And this took place in 1982. On March 18th, I met Janco at his studio in Tel Aviv, and then the interview continued, and I have a separate tape recording of that 2 days later in Hod on March 20th, 1982. I didn't know what to expect at first, and I was kind of shocked that Janco spoke English so perfectly. I remember having asked him, off the record, it's not part of our interview, why he spoke English so well. He said, well, everyone does. That's a kind of surprise for an American to hear, since we barely speak our own language well enough. But he lapsed every once in a while into French, which he spoke every bit as well as he spoke English, possibly even better. His daughter was there, Dadi Janco, and she showed me photographs and various clippings involved in the Zurich Dada movement. And she very generously photocopied, or allowed me actually to photocopy every single one of them. So I have the complete archive relating to Zurich Dada of the documents that Janco himself had saved. And I understand from Raya that these documents have somehow disappeared, so my photocopies may be the only thing that is now currently available, and I am in the process with Raya of donating this archive to the Hod Museum, and I'm also hoping to donate it all. I have quite a few photographs, a lot of archival material, the original transcripts of the interviews, and I think it would be of greater use there than certainly anywhere else. So Dadi Janco showed me that photograph on the left of Marcel in his studio in 1917. So I asked Mr. Janco if he could sit in the chair and more or less strike the same pose in 1982. There are some 65 years that separate those two, but there is something that they certainly have in common. One is that this emphasis on abstraction is something that Janco retained and held to the end of his life. And what comes through in our interview is that he brings it up several times, because you see, abstraction for him was a universal language, the thing he thought that everybody of all nationalities could understand. And that was something, the universal expression that he thought could separate the artists from the Dada period from those who came before, and aim in a whole new direction. Now, if you advance the next slide, in the first letter that I had written to Janco, I asked him a whole series of questions. One was about the origin of the word Dada. There was a great controversy at that time in the mid to late 70s as to how the word came about, because we all know that Tristan Tzara said he stabbed randomly into a dictionary and came upon this word Dada. The reason it's so controversial is because ARP came up with a whole different scenario for how it was discovered. So in that first letter, I asked Marcel Janco if he could explain to me the origin of the term Dada. He said he was not present at the time when Tzara stabbed into a dictionary, so he couldn't help me. So that one was one of the questions I had to ask, but I had a series of a lot of really important questions, including that one I mentioned earlier about whether or not Lenin came to the Cabaret Voltaire. It turned out, by the way, in the early 1990s that a researcher in Zurich discovered that the word Dada was familiar to all of them, not necessarily from stabbing at random in a dictionary, but it was up on the city streets throughout Zurich because there was a hair product called Dada, and there were advertisements showing women with flowing hair who had used this hair product, the kind of shampoo, and it was called Dada shampoo. So I would, of course, have asked him that question too, had I known it at the time, if he remembered that poster. But of course, I didn't know it myself yet. Well, one of the things that I also wanted to ask him about was the diary of Hugo Ball. That's what you see in the English version up there on the left. And in it, he talks about the people who responded to an advertisement he put in the Zurich newspapers for young artists and those with artistic inclinations to come and meet at the Cabaret Voltaire. They showed up, as you can see there, on the 5th of February, 1916, and he records in his diary later that evening the people who were in attendance. He said the place was jammed, you can see there. Many people could not even find the seat. And then he describes these people who came in, which I highlight there in yellow. Marcel Janco, the painter, Tristan Tzara, Georges Janco, and a fourth gentleman whose name I could not quite catch. For some reason, I really wanted to know who that fourth gentleman was. And I asked Marcel Janco, and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't remember, but you could always write to my brother, Jules, who was still living. He was only a year younger in Montreal. And you can see up there my letter, or his letter to me, written on May 3rd. This was after I conducted my interview with Marcel Janco. And there he tells me who that fourth gentleman was. He said, and it's rather strange. Well, I thought I could actually read it from the letter, but the faces of the people who are part of watching the thing are on top of it, so I can't really read that letter. But he did say, he does explain to me that he was actually the person present. Jules, not George. They had a younger brother named George, and they told Hugo Ball that day that he would soon be coming to Zurich. But for some reason, saying the word Georges was easier for Hugo Ball than Jules. And he said that throughout his period in Zurich in 1916 and 17, he was referred to as George by the name of his younger brother rather than Jules. But he was the one who was one of those 5 people that walked into the Cabaret Voltaire that day. And he does say that the fourth person was a certain Mr. Narcisse Cohen, a businessman who had the ugliest face I ever saw. And so far, I don't think this Narcisse Cohen has ended up in the literature of Dada, nor do I know whether or not that much more is known about him, but I think he was a friend of Marcel Janco's father, who was a retail merchant in Bucharest and who made suits. And I think he could be the person who oversaw the Janco family, because in the end, there was not only Marcel, but also Jules and George all in the city at the same time studying. So that letter, by the way, is a very important letter. It's 2 pages long, and he describes the events that took place during those critical months of the Dada period in Zurich in 1916-17. And that will, of course, be one of the letters included in the archive that I donate to the museum. Now, if you advance the next 2 slides, well, I keep saying 2 because there's always 2. Anyway, I was also interested in finding out what happened to Janco's painting of the Cabaret Voltaire. You see it in a black and white illustration. It appeared in Robert Motherwell's book, full page, in black and white though, and that was published in 1951. So I had assumed possibly that the painting still existed somewhere. Of course, I asked Janco to explain exactly who the people were, and that quotation you see in the middle tells you that, of course, Hugo Ball is the guy at the piano there in the background. You can just see him. I think I can still point things out. I don't know if you can see that pointer, but anyway, that's Hugo Ball. Then, of course, there's Tristan Tzara with his arms extended. Holzenbeck is standing right next to him. And he, Marcel Janco, is just behind him right there. That figure, and another person he can't remember, but he can't remember that tall figure in the background. But there to the right is Emmy Henning dancing, and then he says a chanteuse at the bottom whose name he couldn't recall. Now, I was adamant about finding out what had happened to that painting, and I did not know until I did some research preparing for this lecture that earlier Janco had made a color version of it in a limited edition that you see on the right, which I'm presuming is still available and maybe even purchasable at the Van Hode Museum. But the painting, the original painting itself, he could not find. He said to me, I lost trace of this painting already in the 30s. This is what Janco told me in his interview. I knew that it was in Switzerland somewhere. One day, I received in Israel a medicine booklet from Germany, and I was surprised to find a reproduction of my painting in it. So I wrote to the newspapers in the city where the booklet was printed and various other people in the area, to the council and so forth, but I could not find it. I actually believe that painting on the left still exists somewhere, possibly in Switzerland, who knows? But I'm hoping between now and the time I'm no longer a resident on this planet, it will materialize and I'll be able to see that picture at one point. And if the word is spread far and wide enough, perhaps someday it will show up. Okay, if you advance the next slide. In the interview with Janco, I asked many specific questions, but the answers were rather precise and detailed, and rarely did he step back and give me a kind of more universal thought about what Dada was all about, except for the section in the one paragraph that I quote there before about politics. Because he said at first he had no political ideas, but the war made us realize that the brotherhood between us. We thought the war between the Germans and French was criminal. They fought it like beasts, like animals. At some kilometers in Zurich, we could hear the bombardments. Eventually, we thought of ourselves responsible for the drama of Verdun and the crimes that surrounded us. To the stage of the Cabaret Voltaire, we brought the protests of our generation against the failure and bankruptcy of European culture, which led to war. The supreme crime against humanity was a reason for our fight to destroy previous art and to build a new art that would serve the friendship between people and nations. A better definition of Dada could not be given. So I'm very happy he responded to that in that way. Of course, I asked him about the various participants in the movement, like Tristan Tzara, that's a mask he made of him on the left, and all of the other individuals who took part in the movement, especially right in the beginning in 1916. Not from Hugo Ball all the way up, as you see, to Viking Egling. And he provided little snippets on each and every one of those people. Now, if you advance the next slide, of course, I eventually got to the subject about Lenin, but did not know, and he volunteered the information, that the students of Dr. Jung, who of course was a famous Swiss psychoanalyst, came to the Cabaret Voltaire. And you see, he said, we had long discussions with them, but they concluded that we were not sane. By the way, I sent this transcribed interview back to Janco so that he could approve of it. And it's rather interesting that that word sane was not the word he used in the original interviews. He said that we were mashugana. He said, that's a Yiddish word. I don't want that in there. Take it out, put the word sane. It was nearly the only correction he requested for the entire interview. Anyway, as you can see, he goes on to say that they never really understood what they were looking at, the abstract on the walls. They just couldn't seem to understand it. And of course, in the one on the right, he does say that Lenin came. And I was very happy that he did, because he spoke in detail. He said, Lenin, who was living very nearby, came quite often, not really to accept our views, but to see if these very original people might be of some help in his political view. We talked a lot. He was against abstract art. As with all communist ideology, Lenin was opposed to anything that could not serve the communist cause. I'm not so sure that that was his position then during the Dada years, but of course it certainly became that when communism got underway, and he was, of course, secretly sent from Zurich on a train to Moscow. and left the area of the Cabaret Voltaire. So at least for the first time ever, I had on record that Lenin attended these sessions at the Cabaret Voltaire. Now, you advance the next slide. Of course, I wanted to talk about his work too, Janco's. And I asked about the ball in Zurich, this painting that's now in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And I asked it rather extended question because I wanted to know whether or not it had anything to do with simultaneity, the whole concept that existed in Paris, and in this particular case, certainly existed when they recited their simultaneous poems, all in different languages at one time at the Cabaret Voltaire. And he said, no, very simply, there's just only a free composition of colors and forms recalling the movement of dance. That's all. He was sort of dismissive about his own work, but in a modest way that I actually found very admirable. If you advance to the next two slides, he was a remarkably innovative artist in this period in 1916 and 17 in Zurich. I asked him about this other work called Locke, which I think is in the Tel Aviv Museum, but I do not know what present state it's in because that photograph on the left, I scanned from the Mendelssohn book, but Janco left me with a photograph, which will be part of my archive that you'll get, of the Locke in that newly constructed constructivist frame that's around it. So it should be ideally in that form on the right when exhibited in the museum. But anyway, he said, generally my abstractions are without limitation. The one called Locke, for example, is simply bound to the idea of a lot, like a section of a lot, while others are tied to the ideas of growth. So if you advance the next slide, I'll show you the one tied to the idea of growth. And of course, that says white on white, the work from 1916, which he said contains the idea of a plant. You can see the leaves and flowers, and that's all. That work on the left is a remarkably innovative relief. It's made of plaster, and of course, as such, is rather fragile. And he gave it to Jean Arp, who takes a very similar technique, in his case, with cut pieces of plywood and a jigsaw, and really develops an entire career out of this sort of work. So it ends up being a very important object, but unfortunately, Jean Arp gave it to his brother, Francois, who dropped it and smashed it. However, he mentioned to me, Janco, that Zara had made a replica of it. So that must exist in the Arp Foundation, I would imagine, in Switzerland. And on the right, you see another relief with mirrors from 1916, which I thought would be among the most important works made in this period because it actually incorporated a mirror that was painted on. But he said, no, I don't think that's my most significant work from this period. I worked in wire sculptures and made plaster paintings on canvas. And indeed, that's exactly what I was working up to asking him about, because these are remarkably innovative works. If you advance the next set of slides, you'll see the cover of Dada 1, produced in July of 1917. And inside, you'll see Marcel Janco's construction number 3. Well, that certainly intrigued me, particularly by the fact that it had construction 3, which means there must be 2 others. So I was very anxious to ask Janco about this and about the sculpture as such. If you advance the next 2 slides, you'll see the sculpture in detail on the left, and on the right, another sculpture that he gave me a photograph of that was remarkable. He even told me that the size on the one on the left was 80 to 70 centimeters high, just less than a meter, but the one on the right was as high as 2 meters. That's 6 feet. It must have been an absolutely remarkable and striking sculpture. And I cannot tell you as an historian how important these works are and how very different they are from any sculpture that had preceded it. In fact, Brancusi is given credit as the first person to incorporate a base with the sculpture. That's not true, since these are earlier, and you can see that base on the left becomes part of the sculpture. He said that right in the dead center is a rosette, where I don't know if you can see my arrow, but you can see it there in the center. Taken, he told me, from a gravestone. He just picked it up, a little metal rosette, and he emphasized the fact that the upper portion of the sculpture was made of fil de fer, very thin wires that were intended to move when you walk by the sculpture. I mean, this section looks half Calder, half Miro. It's so far ahead of its time that in terms of its historical importance, it could not be more valuable, including the sculpture on the right, which is called L'Univers, Universe, where you can see that eye. There's an artificial eye stuck into this plaster globe. And these are shockingly important sculptures for their time. And I believe they should re-exist. That is to say, I believe replicas of these works should be made and put on display, maybe even in an edition so that other examples could be sold. I think with the advantage of 3D printing now, this could be accomplished. If you look carefully at the one on the right, you could certainly replicate the positioning of the wires. I don't know what these square-like shapes are, or how he created them, but I think that could all be figured out. In fact, I do discuss this very point with Janco, as you'll see when we go on. If you advance the next two slides, there was another question I was very anxious to ask him. In June of 1916, so that means the Cabaret Voltaire only had like 5.5 months of lasting, because he said, and he explained to me, there was a curfew that was imposed on the people of Zurich, and you couldn't keep the lights on after 10 o'clock, and the cabaret just gets started at 10 o'clock. So they had a lot of problems in the beginning. But in the final day of the Cabaret Voltaire, Hugo Ball came out and recited his poem, his Caruana poem. In the last lecture that was given in this series last week, we had a recreation of that. So you had an idea of the poem sort of recited and animated. But the one thing that I discovered and never challenged Janco on is that in his diaries, Hugo Ball says, and you see that in the emphasized section, I made myself a special costume for it. And then Janco in the interview said, as I designed a costume, there was, I can't read through the rest of that. What did he say? Well, anyway, as I designed and executed Hugo Ball's cylindrical costume. So he's saying that I myself designed it and executed it. And then when I wrote to Jules Janco, he said that the costume was designed by Marcel, but done by myself. It was fun to do it and even more to undo it. So at this point, I think we will never know, and maybe that's very typically and characteristic of Dada, who exactly designed and executed that costume. But at any rate, that was the conclusion of the Cabaret Voltaire. Now, if you advance the next two slides, Janco called me back to his apartment before I left, and he gave me a few works of art. Very generously gave me his edition of White on White that you see there on the left. And on the right, he gave me the Création du Monde, also from a later edition, which he inscribed to me. And if you advance to the next two slides, he also handed me this painting, which I was very touched because it's a mistake in the corner. That caption is incorrect. The creation of the world is wrong. This, of course, was far more important, actually. It was a study for the Red Sea, the big painting from 1949. And I'm not sure where that painting is. Maybe it's in the museum in Eindhoven, but anyway, that's a study for it. And if you advance to the next slide, yes. About a year after, well, a little longer than a year after my interview with Janco took place, I received in the mail a copy of the book, the monograph that I mentioned earlier. It was entirely in Hebrew. Even though the book bears a copyright date of 1982, he sent it to me in February of 1984 with a note saying that it just appeared. So I know that there were quite a few problems with its production, so it was delayed. So I guess it did come out right in the beginning of 1984. And he sent me a note with it. It's not the note you see reproduced here, but another note explaining that he would write again to me at greater length. But he inscribed the book to me with friendship and, well, amitié, sympathie. For Francis Newman, he called me instead of Naumann, common mistake I lived with for my whole life. Notre bon ami, Marcel Janco, February 1984. And he also then sent me the follow-up letter that you see there in the middle. You see it's dated February 14th, 1984, and Janco would die just a few months later in that year. And he, at this point, he was writing exclusively to me in French, but very easy French to understand. And I responded in that letter that you see on the right in 1984, February 17th, acknowledging the receipt of the book, telling him that I think some of the reproductions had incorrect captions because I could at least still read the numbers that they assigned for the dates on works. But I also said that he was telling me in his letter that they were thinking about doing the masks in an edition and wanted to know what advice I could provide. And I said, yes, he should do the masks in an edition of 8 signed and numbered copies, just like the Duchamp ready-mades. But I also jumped at the opportunity to tell him he should also recreate those 2 sculptures and produce them in an edition, at least one that could keep one outside of the edition that he could give to the Anhode Museum and the others to be sold. Because you see, Duchamp's ready-mades, for example, only exist in your mind. If you didn't produce these examples that you actually could see in museums, you don't walk in front of them and ask yourself all of the logical questions that they almost demand to be asked. You know, is this a work of art? What's it doing there? Who put it there? And you would ask similar questions, certainly important historical questions, if you were confronted and you saw visually these works by Marcel Janco. And I would love for them to, at one point, in not too distant future, to still be produced in some form or another. Maybe they already exist for all I know. I'll find out later, I guess. But if you advance the next slide, you all don't fall asleep on me there. This is what happened right after I received Janco's letter. On April 21st, he died. They say he was 89 years old in the New York Times, but I think if you do the math correctly, his birthday wasn't until the next month, so he should have been 88, but I don't know, I could be wrong there. Not good at the math. Wait a minute, could you go back to that last slide? I wasn't quite finished with it. Yes, no, there, you got it. Okay, I wrote immediately when I found this in the paper to Dada Janco, his daughter, and said I was very proud and honored to had the opportunity to write about her father's accomplishments while he was still living. I can only hope that he was as pleased by the interest I expressed in his work, and that our published interview will serve to inform future generation of artists, spelled there, and scholars of his important contribution to the history of art. Now, if you advance the next slide, Dada Janco wrote to me right away, and there's just one thing that she says in there. She said that her father, of course, worked and was creative to the end of his life, even just a few works before. He had attended a luncheon with friends at the Janco Museum and said, and I love what she quotes there, "It is indeed very difficult to be young," he said, "to be a painter, and at the same time to be old." It was a wonderful last quote from Marcel Janco that I'm happy to have and share with you. Now, advance the next 2 slides. I had hoped that my interview would, Yuval, can you now advance the next slide? There. I had hoped that my interview with Janco would have been seen and read by thousands of people interested in Dada. The problem was that it was published in Arts Magazine. Arts Magazine was not indexed by the Art Index. So to this very day, when people go look for even just the word Janco in the Art Index, they do not come up with my interview. So I know that I sent many copies of it to Janco, and they were supposed to be made available in photocopies at the museum, so at least people saw it in that way. But it was noticed by the French, by this man, Patrice Cotanzin, who translated the interview into French and published it in 2005 in a little booklet. I was just rather disappointed that he could only have about 6 illustrations in the text, so he was missing many of those that were part of the original interview, though I'm still hoping that at one point this interview will even be translated into Hebrew and published perhaps in the form of a little book, but fully illustrated this time with the materials that I'm going to donate to the and Hove Museum. Anyway, if you advance to the next two slides, and I think the last, Yuval, there. There's just one last statement that I prepared that I wanted to read at the end to sum up. I remain very proud of the fact that still in my early 30s, I had the wherewithal to seek out and establish contact with the artists involved in the Dada movement earlier in the century. It gave these artists the opportunity to speak about their participation in an artistic movement that was, I believe then and still believe today, the most important artistic revolution to have taken place in Western art since the Renaissance. Indeed, I feel that what the Dadaists did at the beginning of the 20th century, merging art and life, exemplified by their performances at the Cabaret Voltaire and their use of collage, photomontage, and assemblage, is the aesthetic equivalent of what the discovery of linear perspective did for artists in the 15th century. Just as the invention of that technique affected the arts for the next 5 centuries, I believe that the Dada spirit will continue to influence the work of contemporary artists for at least as long, if not longer. Dada was born out of revolt, in the case of the original Dadaists against the atrocities of the First World War. But the ill treatment of others will continue to exist within a society. So artists will always have something to react against, allowing Dada and the spirit of rebellion that fueled it to persist indefinitely. What Marcel Janco created in the early years of Dada in Zurich was the byproduct of a revolution, one that continues to reverberate to this very day within the hearts and minds of young artists who will, to be sure, continue his legacy. Thank you. That's what I have to present. And if you have any questions, I guess you can open it up to the floor and ask away.
First, I would like to thank you, Francis, very much. I thought I knew everything, but I learned a lot of things that I never knew. And if anybody has some comments, I would like to hear. Michaela?
Hi, Mr. Naumann. My name is Michaela. I'm the daughter of the late Daddy Janco.
Oh, hi. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, I think I met you. I even met you when you were in Israel. I was maybe 15 at the time. And I very much appreciate, I was very moved by what you recounted. And of course, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the family for your contribution to the Museum of the Archives. The Red Sea, I think, I mean, there are a few versions, but I think the most famous one belongs to my mother's sister, Josine, and is now in the hands of her daughter, Elissa. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, the point of making this so-called convention on Zoom was to talk about the Dada heritage and the Janco heritage. So I think you definitely contributed a lot to that. So I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah.
Thank you, Michaela. We really hope that we'll be able to publish all the lectures that we had. Most of them are in our website, and hopefully very soon they'll be printed. If there aren't any other comments, I would like to thank you all for coming. I noticed that some of you were in all the Zooms, so you'll get extra points. And what I would really like is to thank my colleague, Professor Michael Finkenthal, and Dr. Ronit Milano, and of course, Michaela Janco. It was her idea. And I hope to see you again in one of our other Zoom events. And thank you.
Yeah, before you finish,
yes.
there's a question on chat. Maybe
Yes.
Mr. Naumann can address it. Mr. Kachur, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing it right. Yeah. What does Francis recall about Janco as a personality and the state of his studio?
It's Louis Katcher.
Okay.
I told him about this lecture, that's his name, but anyway, it's a good question. I recall that in his studio, it was fairly well organized because I had been in many artist studios before that were quite the opposite. And you know, there's a question I would have asked myself. Are there any questions that I would have asked Janco that I forgot to ask, or that I was too ignorant to ask at the time? One, of course, would have been about that word Dada and the hair product. But the other, I would have liked to ask him about his girlfriends, because the reason that becomes important is that now in every subsequent description of Janco, they describe how strikingly handsome and charismatic he was. And I do know that he had a series of girlfriends in Zurich. And in fact, he did mention that he left one like as a gift for Hans Arp when he left. And I just would like to know, well, sort of, because they were all together, let's say. And he said that he had left her and he always liked Arp, but I don't know how true that is because, you know, Sophie Taubor was already there. So I don't know what happened later. I don't know, but I would have liked to know because these relationships, and one of them, I think, is the reason that Janco left in 1919 from Zurich to go live in Paris. He was living with some woman. I know nothing about those personal relationships. Maybe they don't and shouldn't enter into the art history of things, but it does sometimes account for a person's whereabouts and why they're in a certain place at a certain time.
He was married to Micheline Ackermann, that we know, the daughter of the mother of Josine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, when did he marry her? In 1920, right?
I'm not sure, but yeah, around that time, yeah.
Okay. But anyway, I neglected to ask those things, and maybe they were inappropriate at the time, but they still intrigue me. And I'd still like to know the answers, but anyway.
There's another question by Mr. Gal. Can you elaborate on the connection between the performances at Cabaret Voltaire and Janco's plastic work?
Well, you know, there was that idea that they were working toward a common goal. This you see, a simultaneous poem read by 5 people in different languages all at the same time ends up being incomprehensible. Therefore, it ends up being the equivalent, you could say, of an abstract picture that has no particular subject, but just presents itself in its abstract array. And on that level, the meaningless of that poem, the inability to decipher and understand it, is similar to what an abstract painting can present. And I think they were thinking on that level, on one way or another, because you see, the one thing that you really always have to be reminded of is that the war was happening, and they could remember, he said he could hear the bombardments in their beds at night. So the atrocities of what was going on, they were standing in direct opposition to it. So what made the most sense to them is a thing that made no sense. So reading a poem by picking out random fragments from a hat was far more sensible as an approach than the logic that caused the First World War to come in existence. Because if you think about it, the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand was a comparatively minor event, but because the countries were stiffly allied, there's an offense occurs to you, I'm on your side, and if offense occurs to them, I'm on that side. So that was the problem. It was logic that caused everyone and the dominoes to fall in 2 different directions and cause that First World War, and they were against that. So introducing chance as a medium within a work of art or introducing abstraction or anything that was a total alternative to the logic that led to the First World War made all the sense in the world. So I think the performances at the Cabaret Voltaire, including the one that Hugo Ball gave at the end of nonsense syllables that just rhymed or intentionally didn't rhyme, made that was the logic of what they were doing. And I did ask him about Janco, you'll see in the interview, about those simultaneous poems and how the people reacted, how they're sitting in their seats, looking up, wondering what's going on. And that's when he said they thought we were Meshuggah. So, and I guess they would have just thought they were all crazy, but that didn't stop them. That's the interesting part of it all. So, any other questions? Were there any more on the chat?
No, but would you say a few words about his personality?
Well, you see, that's why I said that thing about his various girlfriends. He had an unbelievable twinkle in his eye, and he was charismatic. It was still there. And there was something about that I wished I had asked more about, because I think that his success, part of his success, and maybe it's true for everybody, because it becomes a reflection of their personality on one level or another. And he was outgoing, very articulate, handsome, strikingly handsome. Everybody says that about him. So, those are things you're born with and that you can either use or not use. And it seems that he chose to use them to advance whatever his agenda happened to have been. I'm not sure if people will say the same. You can even see photographs of him when he arrived in Palestine. I mean, he was even a pretty handsome man in his 50s and 60s, and he continued to be, I think, to the end of his life. That doesn't happen to all of us. I happen to be partly living proof of that. I know I used to be better looking. So anyway.
Well, Francis, I don't have any question. I just want to tell you that, and all the organizers that I think I speak on behalf of everybody who was involved in this entire operation. We thank you, and we are very glad that you made it. And the only thing I regret is, after having heard you today, is that we didn't put you on at the beginning as well as at the end of the operation. But we will try to do our best to have you again with us. Thank you very much in the name of everybody involved. And Nissim, thank you also for this excellent talk. Bye, everybody.
And thank you.
Oh, you have a question?
Oh, yeah, let's just see if we have any more questions before we close up. And I would like to extend also my own thanks to Professor Naumann. Of course, we were so honored to have you